Stop what you are doing because something just happened that was never supposed to happen. Not in this timeline, not in this balance of power, not in a world where the United States was always at the center of every major alliance. But just minutes ago, in a chamber most Americans never think about, a vote was cast that shattered that assumption completely. 482 votes in favor, 108 against. And with that single decision, Europe sent a message so clear, so direct, and so impossible to ignore that it echoed across Washington before anyone there even had time to respond. This was not just a vote about policy. This was not just diplomacy. This was a choice about who matters, a choice about who can be trusted. And for the first time in decades, that choice was not the United States, it was Canada. And at the center of it all stands one man who turned pressure into power and insults into leverage. By the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly how this happened, why Donald Trump never saw it coming, and why Mark Carney may have just changed the direction of global power in a way that cannot be reversed. For months, the signals were there, but almost no one in Washington took them seriously. It started quietly, almost invisibly, with small shifts in tone coming out of Europe, speeches that sounded slightly different, statements that felt just a little more distant from the United States than before. And then came the tension, trade disagreements, strategic disagreements, military disagreements. But even then, most people assumed this was temporary, just another phase, just another disagreement between allies who had always found their way back to each other. That assumption turned out to be completely wrong. Because while the American administration was focused on tariffs, headlines, and political messaging, something much deeper was happening behind closed doors in Europe. Leaders were asking a question that had not been asked this seriously in decades. What if the United States is no longer a stable partner? Not an enemy, not even a rival, just unreliable. And once that question is asked, everything begins to change. At the same time, Canada was being pushed into a position it had never asked for: public insults, economic pressure, repeated statements questioning its sovereignty, being called the 51st state, being told openly that its future was tied to decisions made in Washington. For a long time, Canada absorbed it, stayed quiet, stayed diplomatic, stayed patient, but patience does not mean inaction. And behind that calm surface, a different strategy was forming. Mark Carney understood something that most people missed. Power is not just about size. It is about trust. It is about stability. It is about being the partner that others can rely on when uncertainty starts to spread. And at a moment when the United States was becoming louder, more aggressive, and more unpredictable, Canada made a very different choice. It became steady, measured, focused, and Europe noticed. That is the part that changes everything, because Europe was not just watching what the United States was doing, it was watching how Canada responded. No escalation, no public breakdown, no reaction driven by emotion, just quiet, calculated moves to build relationships, strengthen agreements, and position itself as something the world was starting to look for again, a dependable ally. So, when the vote finally came, it did not come out of nowhere. It was the result of months of shifting perception, months of quiet alignment, months of Europe slowly realizing that the balance of trust was no longer where it used to be. And when 450 million Europeans are represented in a single decision, that realization carries weight. 482 votes. That number matters because it was not close, it was not divided, it was not uncertain, it was decisive, overwhelming, and impossible to spin. This was not Europe hedging its bets. This was Europe making a statement that said clearly that the future they are preparing for does not look like the past they are leaving behind. And here's where the shock begins to hit. Because while Europe was moving in this direction, the American administration was moving in the opposite one. Doubling down on pressure, doubling down on rhetoric, doubling down on the idea that Canada had no choice but to stay in line. But what happens when the country you think has no options suddenly finds one, and not just any option, but one backed by hundreds of millions of people, massive economic power, and a shared strategic vision? That is the moment we are in right now, the moment where assumptions collapse, the moment where alliances begin to shift, and the moment where one vote in Europe turns into a global signal that cannot be ignored. Because this is not just about who Europe chose, it is about who they did not choose. And that silence, that absence, may be the most powerful message of all. Now, here is where this story stops being symbolic and starts becoming real, because that vote was not just words on paper. It was not just politicians making statements for headlines. It was a green light, a signal to move forward with something that had already been quietly built behind the scenes. And when you look at what Europe actually voted for, you begin to understand why Washington did not just ignore this. They were caught completely off guard. This resolution was about deepening the strategic partnership between Europe and Canada to a level that goes far beyond trade deals and diplomatic visits. This is about defense, security, long-term alignment, the kind of cooperation that usually only exists between the closest allies in the world. And the most important part is this: Canada is not being treated as an outsider anymore. It is being brought inside the system. Think about what that means for a second. Europe has spent decades building its own defense capabilities, slowly reducing its dependence on the United States. That process was careful, gradual, and often controversial. But now, for the first time, they have invited a country outside their continent to take part in that structure. Not Britain, not Australia, not even longtime partners in Asia, Canada. This is where Mark Carney's strategy becomes impossible to ignore. While the headlines focused on conflict, he was building access. While attention was on tariffs, he was securing entry into systems that very few countries ever get close to. And when the moment came, Europe did not hesitate. They opened the door. The SAFE instrument is a perfect example of this shift, a massive defense procurement system worth hundreds of billions, designed to allow European nations to coordinate military investments without relying on American suppliers. For years, this was seen as a step toward independence from Washington. And now Canada is part of it, the first non-European country ever included. That is not a small detail. That is a structural change in how alliances are built. Because once you are inside a system like that, you are no longer just a partner. You become part of the process, part of the decision-making, part of the long-term planning. And those kinds of connections do not disappear overnight. They are designed to last for decades. At the same time, trade between Canada and Europe has been expanding at a pace that very few people are talking about. The agreement that came into force years ago is now showing its full impact. Trade volumes climbing, investments flowing, entire sectors becoming interconnected. This is not theoretical growth. This is measurable, real-world alignment that is strengthening every single year. And here is where the contrast becomes almost impossible to ignore. While Canada and Europe are building deeper economic and defense ties, the United States is dealing with internal battles that are weakening its position externally, legal challenges, policy reversals, confusion over trade direction. These are not small issues. These are signals to the rest of the world that stability is no longer guaranteed. From Europe's perspective, this creates a very simple calculation. Do you continue relying on a partner that is becoming unpredictable? Or do you invest in one that is showing consistency? That question does not require emotion. It does not require ideology. It only requires observation, and that is exactly what happened. The 482-108 vote was not just about choosing Canada. It was about choosing a direction that prioritizes stability, coordination, and shared planning over uncertainty and sudden shifts. And once that direction is chosen, everything that follows begins to align with it. But here is the part that makes this even more intense. Because while all of this was being prepared, while agreements were being strengthened and access was being negotiated, the messaging coming out of Washington did not change. The pressure continued. The language stayed aggressive. The assumption remained the same. Canada would have no alternative. That assumption is now gone. And the consequences of that are only just beginning to unfold, because when a country like Canada gains access to new alliances, new markets, and new defense structures, it does not just shift its position slightly. It begins to redefine where it stands in the world. And that brings us to the moment that made this situation impossible to ignore. The moment when words, strategy, and reality all collided at the same time. That moment came faster than anyone expected, because just as Europe made its move, events on the other side of the Atlantic started to unravel in a way that exposed a much bigger problem, not a messaging problem, not a political disagreement, a structural problem. While Europe was voting 482 to 108 to deepen ties with Canada, the United States was dealing with a legal shock that cut straight through its entire trade strategy. A decision from its own highest court suddenly put years of economic pressure into question. Tariffs that were meant to force compliance, to push allies into line, were no longer as solid as they appeared. And when a country starts losing control over its own tools of leverage, everything connected to those tools begins to weaken. Think about the timing. Europe commits to Canada. Canada gains access to new defense and economic systems. And at that exact moment, the main pressure mechanism used by the United States starts facing internal resistance. That is not just coincidence. That is the kind of overlap that changes how global players calculate risk. Because from the outside, the image begins to shift. One side looks like it is building, expanding, stabilizing. The other looks like it is reacting, adjusting, trying to hold on to a position that is no longer guaranteed. And in global politics, perception matters just as much as reality. But here is where the story becomes even more intense, because this is not just about Europe and the United States anymore. This is about what Canada does next. And this is where Mark Carney moved in a way that turned a strategic opportunity into a permanent signal. Within days of the European vote, new announcements started coming out of Canada. Not small announcements, not symbolic gestures, massive commitments that showed exactly how seriously this shift is being taken. Billions allocated toward Arctic infrastructure, plans for expanded military presence in regions that had long been considered remote and secondary. Suddenly, those regions became central. Why does that matter? Because the Arctic is no longer just about geography. It is about control. It is about access. It is about future trade routes, energy potential, and strategic positioning. And by investing heavily in that space, Canada is not just strengthening its own sovereignty. It is positioning itself as a key player in a region that global powers are watching more closely every year. At the same time, Canada's presence in international military exercises began to carry a different weight, not just as a participant, but as a partner that is now directly connected to European planning and coordination. When troops train together, when systems are aligned, when strategies are shared, it creates a level of integration that goes far beyond headlines. And this is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore again. While Canada is expanding its role, strengthening its alliances, and building long-term capabilities, the messaging coming from Washington continues to focus on dominance, pressure, and control. But what happens when those methods stop working? What happens when the country being pressured finds new partners, new systems, and new leverage? That is the question no one in the American administration seems to have answered yet. Because this is not a short-term situation. This is not something that resets after an election cycle or a policy change. The agreements being signed right now, the infrastructure being built, the alliances being strengthened, these are long-term commitments. They are designed to outlast political shifts. They are designed to create stability over decades, not months. And once those structures are in place, reversing them becomes almost impossible. This is the part that turns a surprising moment into a serious turning point, because it is one thing to lose influence temporarily. It is another to watch that influence be replaced by something more stable, more coordinated, and more permanent. And right now, that replacement is happening in real time. But the most powerful part of this story is still ahead, because this is not just about what Europe decided or what Canada is building. It is about what the United States did not see coming and what it still may not fully understand. And this is where the situation becomes uncomfortable, because now we have to look at what the United States is actually facing in this moment. Not the headlines, not the speeches, the reality. For years, the assumption in Washington was simple. No matter what happened politically, no matter how tense things became, the structure of global alliances would hold. Canada would stay close. Europe would stay aligned, and the United States would remain at the center of it all. That assumption is now being tested in a way that very few people were prepared for, because what just happened in Europe was not emotional. It was not reactive. It was calculated. It was the result of watching patterns over time and making a decision based on where those patterns were leading. And when decisions are made like that, they are not easily reversed. Now think about the position this puts the American administration in. You spent months applying pressure on a country you believed had no alternative. You used tariffs, you used rhetoric, you used public statements that questioned its sovereignty. And instead of forcing alignment, you triggered diversification. Instead of pulling Canada closer, you pushed it into the arms of another major power bloc. That is not just a diplomatic setback. That is a strategic miscalculation. Because here's the problem with pressure as a strategy. It only works if the other side has nowhere else to go. The moment another option appears, that pressure loses its effectiveness. And if that option is not just viable but attractive, then the entire strategy begins to collapse. That is exactly what we are seeing right now. Europe did not just offer Canada an alternative. It offered something that looks increasingly valuable in today's world: predictability, coordinated policy, shared long-term planning. These are things that markets trust. These are things that militaries rely on. These are things that governments build strategies around. And once those systems start connecting, once trade flows increase, once defense structures begin to align, the relationship stops being flexible. It becomes structural. This is the word that matters most here. Structural, because a structural relationship does not depend on personalities. It does not change based on a single election or a shift in tone. It is built into agreements, institutions, and long-term investments. It becomes part of how countries operate. Right now, Canada and Europe are moving toward that kind of relationship. And here's where the pressure on Washington intensifies, because how do you respond to that? What is the counter strategy? You cannot simply reverse a parliamentary vote in Europe. You cannot easily pull Canada out of agreements it has already signed. You cannot undo billions in investment that are already in motion. So what is left? That is the question that is starting to echo more and more, not just in political circles, but in economic and strategic ones as well. Because the longer this situation continues, the more those new connections strengthen, and the harder it becomes to shift the balance back. And while all of this is happening, the messaging coming from the United States has not fully adapted to the new reality. The language is still focused on control. The tone is still focused on dominance. But the environment has changed. The assumptions that supported that approach are no longer as solid as they once were. This is where timing becomes critical. Because in global politics, there are moments where small changes can be managed, and then there are moments where those changes pass a certain point and they start reinforcing themselves, where every new agreement leads to another, every new partnership creates more opportunities, every new investment deepens the connection. We are moving into that second phase right now. And once that momentum builds, stopping it becomes incredibly difficult, which brings us to the most important question of all. Not what happened, not even why it happened, but what it means going forward. Because if this continues, if Canada and Europe keep building on this foundation, then the global balance of power is not just shifting temporarily, it is being rewritten. And now we arrive at the part that cannot be undone. Not next week, not next year, not even after a change in leadership. Because what is happening right now is moving beyond politics and into structure, beyond headlines and into reality. The agreements are already in place. The partnerships are already active. The systems are already connecting. And every day that passes, those connections grow stronger. This is what makes this moment different from everything that came before it. In the past, tensions between allies could be smoothed over with meetings, statements, and time, but this is not just tension, this is redirection, a slow but very real shift in where trust is placed, where investment flows, and where long-term planning is anchored. Europe has made its position clear, not with words, but with numbers. 482 votes. That is not hesitation. That is commitment. That is a signal to markets, to militaries, to governments around the world that a new alignment is forming and it is not centered the way it used to be. And Canada has responded in a way that confirms it understands exactly what is at stake. This is not about replacing one partner with another. It is about reducing dependence, expanding options, building a future where no single country can dictate the terms. That kind of strategy does not create headlines overnight, but over time it changes everything because once a country builds multiple strong alliances, once it connects itself to different economic and defense systems, it becomes harder to pressure, harder to isolate, and harder to control. That is where Canada is heading right now. And for the United States, this creates a situation that is far more complex than it may appear on the surface, because this is not just about repairing a relationship. It is about competing with an alternative that is already being built, an alternative that offers stability, an alternative that offers coordination, an alternative that is growing stronger with every agreement signed and every project launched. So the question is no longer whether this shift is happening, it is already happening. The real question is how far it will go. Will this remain a strong partnership between Canada and Europe, or will it expand into something even bigger, something that pulls more countries into its orbit over time? Because if that happens, then what we are witnessing right now will not just be remembered as a surprising vote in a European Parliament. It will be remembered as the moment the balance of global influence began to move in a new direction. And here is the part that makes this story personal, because this is not just about leaders, policies, or international strategy. It is about identity. It is about how a country sees itself and how it is seen by the world. For years, Canada was described as dependent, as secondary, as tied to decisions made elsewhere. But today, 450 million Europeans made a different statement. They chose Canada, not as a follower, not as an extension of someone else, but as a partner. And that changes the conversation completely. So now the question comes to you. Do you believe this is the right direction? Should Canada continue building these deeper ties with Europe and expanding its global role? Or should it focus on repairing and strengthening its relationship with the United States before this shift goes any further? Because one thing is certain, the world is not standing still. The alliances are not waiting. And the decisions being made right now are shaping a future that will define the next generation. If this opened your eyes to something you had not fully seen before, share it with someone who needs to understand what is happening, because this is bigger than a single headline. Subscribe if you have not already, because this story is not over, not even close. And if you want to see how another country made a similar move and what happened next, watch the next video on your screen right now. Same pattern, same shift, same consequences. Stay informed, stay aware, because history is not something that already happened. It is something that is happening right now.